Economic Inequality and Globalization, an analysis of the identity and critical theory perspectives. Some important key terms include the critical theory perspective, identity perspective, levels of analysis, globalization, development, and economic inequality. The critical theory perspective emphasizes embedded historical change. Factors contributing to exploitation of non-Western people include marginalization, imperialism, oppression, capitalism, and colonialism. All these factors contribute to globalization and development. The identity perspective emphasizes on Western European ideas, which include beliefs, values, and norms. These factors contribute to globalization and development. The levels of analysis are the direction or level from which the primary cause of events is coming. The critical theory perspective denies the possibility of separating perspectives and levels of analysis. The levels of analysis are the direction or level from which the primary cause of events is coming. The identity perspective has four levels of analysis: the systemic level, which focuses on shared or conflicting ideas; the foreign policy level, which focuses on ideological alignments abroad which strengthen or weaken ideological groups at home; the domestic level, which focuses on a country's political culture or ideology; and the individual level, which focuses on a leader's ideologies or strategies.
There are three eras of globalization. Globalization 1.0, which was the early period of globalization from 1492 to 1800, which was driven by mercantilism and colonialism. Globalization 2.0, which was the later period of globalization from 1800 to 1950, which was driven by global market institutions such as multinational trading and multinational corporations. And Globalization 3.0, which is the latest period of globalization, starting in the second half of the 20th century, driven by the flattening of the global playing field and the knowledge economy rather than by imperialism or manufacturing conglomerates. Development is the process of material, institutional, and human progress in a particular country or region.
Economic inequality is differing positions within the economic distribution of income, pay, and wealth.
How do these factors affect our world? Sub-Saharan Africa. Economic inequality in sub-Saharan Africa from the critical theory perspective is a product of Portuguese colonialism, which caused irreparable damage to the structure and culture of sub-Saharan African society and also promoted rampant exploitation of poorer peoples, lands, and resources. The transatlantic slave trade did unimaginable multi-generational damage to family structures and often pitted indigenous people against each other. Marginalization of indigenous peoples made racial and social minorities powerless to the will of multinational corporations and colonial powers. Latin America. Economic inequality in Latin America from the critical theory perspective is a product of Spanish colonialism, which caused irreparable damage to the structure and culture of Latin American society and also promoted rampant exploitation of poorer peoples, lands, and resources. The transatlantic slave trade promoted an agriculturally based economy and retarded domestic industrial development. Imperialism, often promoted by religion, marginalized indigenous and minority peoples. Spanish colonialism promoted the idea of the dependency theory, which is a process where labor and agricultural resources are reconfigured to produce exports important to Western European society, which in turn leads to the abandonment of traditional food sources in terms of trade beneficial to the center of imperial power or metropole. Systemic inequality is promoted by the dependency theory.
Economic inequality in Latin America from the identity perspective. Adherence to the identity perspective would point out that 32% of Latin American income goes to 10% of the population, 15% goes to the poorest 40% of the population. 5% of the population owns 70 to 90% of property. There are sizable disenfranchised factions of communities. Politicians and private companies employ protectionist policies that curtail economic growth. There is a large informal sector of the economy. Industrial development is held back by fraternal ties that suffocate initiative and entrepreneurship. There is considerable religious influence on government. Asia.
Economic inequality in Asia, from the critical theory perspective, is a product of European colonialism like the East India Companies and current multinational corporations who target small, defenseless nations and people by exploiting labor, degrading culture and language, and creating a sensitivity and distrust of foreign investment, which can sometimes lead to slow or stagnant economic growth. Western style capitalism promotes a division of labor that is difficult to uproot and that separates core, peripheral, and semi peripheral states by long standing traditional exports, with core states producing exports of highest demand. Marginalization of indigenous people makes them powerless to the will of multinational corporations and colonial powers.
Economic inequality in Asia from the identity perspective. Adherence to the identity perspective would point to the emergence of authoritarian regimes post World War II that stifled labor concerns. Then the eventual spread of democracy during the 1980s, which led to increased stability and investment in the region. Implementation of land reforms, primary education, housing, and health services have helped to address concerns of economic inequality. The rate of economic development often paralleled efforts toward land reform. Many Asian governments adopted export led economic policies which increased globalization and economic viability.